Hi everybody, it's great to be back here again anytime on this Friday. Let's get right down to our Torah lesson. I apologize, last week I was away and now I'm back. This week's portion again, Parashat Toldot. Toldot begins with the letter Tuf and ends with the letter Tuf, reflecting some kind of cycle. In the world, we're in a cycle, it turns around and returns to its first point. And I'd like to explain what I'm referring to, and this is really the topic of this week's lesson. Number one, if we look at the story, right away it stands out so powerfully. The story of Yitzchak, and how Rebecca is convincing her son Yaakov to steal the blessing from Esav. Number one, it seems immoral, going ahead and lying and convincing Isaac that this is really not, this is really Esav and not Jacob, whatever it was. That's an immoral kind of story. Doesn't really jive with the great characters we're dealing with, great righteous people. Number one. Number two, the fact that Yitzchak seems very, very, in one way, to favor Esav. Like, what is this favoring of Esav coming? Where does it come from? Obviously, he knows exactly who Jacob is. We say later on, he gives him the blessing of Abraham. He knows exactly who his son Jacob is. He knows he's the righteous one. He knows he's the one who sits in the tents and studies Torah all day. It's not that he doesn't know the truth. He knows exactly who his children are. But we see his tolerance for Esav goes beyond our understanding. Number one, Esav he married a Canaanite woman. And we see that in this week's portion, that later on Esav saw that when he sends Jacob to marry from the family, he sends him all the way out to Padan Aram to go find a nice Jewish girl, because he wasn't too thrilled with the Canaanite ladies, but Esav already had taken them and they were living in his house and they were worshipping idols, whatever it was. So Isaac had a pretty difficult time having to raise these, an Esav in his house, but he was very, very tolerant to him. And we see that he always found the good in Esav. And he said to him, go out and get me a nice meal the way I like it. Right? He knew how to focus him on the strength and on the special qualities that Esav had. But on the other hand, Rivka would love her son. It didn't say why she loved her son. Obviously, she obviously was focused on the goodness within her son Jacob. And she wasn't able to cope so much with the difficult character traits of her son Esav, but Isaac was able to cope with that. But here it comes down to push to shove. Isaac is a prophet, and of course we know Rebecca is a prophet, but here, interesting, there's some kind of struggle, tension going on between these two great giants about raising the children, number one, and number two, about how to cope with this present situation. Not only, how to deal with it. Now, Rivka goes ahead and does something that seems very, very, very difficult. She goes ahead and pulls one over on her husband and just focuses this blessing, and it turns the blessing from, instead of Esav getting it, Jacob gets the blessing now. And that seems, again, to be something that's hard to understand, immoral in one way. But of course, we know she's a prophet, and she was doing things based on what God was guiding her. But of course, so was Isaac on the other hand. So what's going on over here? Was Isaac blind not only on a physical sense, because he was blind, he was able to see, but was he blind about the way he was behaving towards his son? Should he have done something like Abraham did and threw out Ishmael, just like Sarah told him? Or did he do the right thing by keeping Esav within his home? And it's also very interesting the fact that these two sons were born in that same womb, and one turned out to be Esav, and one turned out to be so righteous. This was all difficult things to understand. But again, just to touch upon something so deep, we must look again in the story of the sin of the first man. I'm sorry, but we always go back somehow to the sin of the first man, because that's where the world really begins. And there's a beautiful, beautiful explanation by the Nachmanides of what this sin is all about. And he says, before the first man sinned, he was on a different state completely. It was hard for us to even understand that state, right? But he did not have free will at that time. So the question is, he didn't have free will, how did he sin? Great question. And obviously the answer is there was some kind of free will, but not like we understand it today. But after he sinned, he then, he gained free will of making choices of a world. The whole world that we know today is a result of the sin of the first man. And what was the sin all about? The sin was about using our senses in the wrong way. And we see right over here how it says in the Bible regarding Chava, she saw the tree. What really attracted her was looking using a sense of vision and a sense of taste. She saw it was very, very tasteful, right? And whatever it was, her human senses distracted her and pulled her into the sin. And it mentions very, very strongly in the verse, Vatera, and she saw, and she looked, and it was good for the eyes. It's mentioning the eyes and seeing. And so interesting how this week's portion, Isaac can't see. He can't see. Now, is that just a coincidence? No, it's not a coincidence. Because everything about Isaac is compensating by using his other senses. We see how the fact that when they put on the garments on his arms, he comes over to feel the arms of Jacob to see if they're really Esav, right? They put on the hairy goat arms. And he smells the garments using the sense of smell. And of course the food using the sense of taste. And the voice, he hears the voice of Jacob, but he says, but instead the sense of touching overcomes that. So we see there's something about senses here. And it's reminding us very well about the sin of the first man, because we see there, they heard the voice of God in the garden afterwards. And beforehand they listened to the voice, listened again to the voice of the snake. The sense of vision we saw very clearly there. The sense of smell is not clear, but it's there also. Because in the garden, it's reflected. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says when Isaac smelled the garments, he smelled the tapuchim of the apples. Now the apples reflect a very, very deep concept of the Garden of Eden. It's called an apple field. It's a very spiritual level. So the same smell of Garden of Eden is what Isaac smells when he smells the garments, because it's brought down that these garments that were worn by Jacob, who were the garments of Esav at this point, go back to the first man. Now Midrash says these are the garments of the first man. So obviously, in many ways, our rabbis who are teaching us great lessons, and I mentioned many times when they write Midrash, it's not a cartoon or it's not mythology over here telling funny stories, but they're connecting us to very deep concepts. And the fact that our rabbis teach us that the garments that Esav had, which now Rebekah put on Jacob, these garments were the garments of the first man. So it's connecting this whole issue here with the first man. Bring it back to the story of the sin of the first man. It's all taking us back to the Garden of Eden. And why? Because our life is a cycle, I mentioned before. It's a life of a cycle of returning. And our duty in this world is, what is our duty as human beings in this world? Is to rectify. And rectifying this world eventually will take us to a situation where we return to the sin before the first man's sin. We'll return to the state where our free will not be on that level of today's free will, choosing good and evil, but it will be a choice between good and good. A much higher level, level of priest before the sin. And this is what really we strive for. And this is what the Nachmanides says also at the end of days. It says in Jeremiah, God will make a new covenant. This is the new covenant, referring to the fact that we will no longer, our hearts will be completely cleansed of this blindness, of sin, of choosing between good and evil. We will now return to that pre-state. And that is what we work very hard for as we do God's will in this world and commandments and follow the word of God and do goodness in this world. We eventually want to return. That's how we return, bring the world to that state. But the beauty is that the world itself will reach that state. And it's hard to understand, right, how a human being can actually reach that state. But we can understand if we look at Moshe Rabbeinu. It's brought down in the Meshech Chochmah, one of the great commentaries. He has a great question. It's mentioned in Exodus regarding Moshe Rabbeinu, that God says the Jewish people will believe in you forever. What do you mean they will believe in you forever? He asks. Moshe Rabbeinu is a human being. He could sin. He has a free choice of sinning. And if he sins, why should they believe in someone that's sinning? And the answer is, he says that Moshe Rabbeinu reached the level in this world that he eliminated his free will anymore. He was at such a high level on this world already that he had no more free will. And that's the priest state before the sin of the first man. And that is what we are working so hard to strive for. Now with this understanding, we can understand all about Isaac and Rebekah. Rebekah and Isaac were struggling. There were two different ways of looking at the world again. I said, looking at the end of days or looking at the present situation. Rebekah was very practical, looking at the present situation, and therefore she saw that sometimes Jacob had to wear the garments of Esav. He had to play that role as well. But Isaac saw the end of days where there'll be this Esav who represents the evil urge, who represents the doing evil in this world will be rectified completely. And therefore, when he saw Esav, he didn't see an evil person. He didn't see his evil deeds. He was already brought all the way back to the Garden of Eden. He already went back before the sin of the garden, before the first man's sin. On the other hand, Rebecca saw the present day situation. The 6,000 years, we have to work hard to strive for that. And she did not see what Isaac saw. And it's so amazing that Isaac didn't have vision, right? He lost his vision. And everything about the sin was from the eyes. Because Isaac didn't have vision, because he didn't have a vision, a physical vision that we saw today. But he saw much greater, much way beyond the human way of looking at things. And therefore, he lost this whole thing. I think it's one chidush I want to mention, is that he didn't see here because of that. Because he already saw in a much different plane. He was already, way beyond. But Rebecca, was in this world, more involved in what was going on, the day-by-day situation. And this conflict, of course, represented two sides of looking at the world, and both are right. Both, of course, are right. But Rebecca, of course, won out at this time. Because God says right now, we're in a world, a physical world, we have to deal with it, we have to rectify, we're not there yet. And therefore, they have to do this whole number on Isaac, who was already in a much higher plane. But it wasn't like Isaac was this senile old man. He knew exactly what he wanted, knew exactly what he was doing. But again, time didn't reach that stage yet. But really, both existed at the same time. And how is that possible? What I'm saying now is the fact that we know in the spiritual realm, there is no time. So everything exists now. So Isaac was so far that he was actually there. He was already in that spiritual. It wasn't like it didn't exist. He was already in that realm. Just like Moses reached that stage way beyond. But the whole world wasn't there yet. And sometimes we have to wait till the world catches up. And that's exactly what his wife, who's the vessel, and it was guiding a husband, saying, listen, right now, you have to land you, my husband, and we have to realize we have to go through this situation of history, of Esav, the kingdom of Edom, and all this rectification until we reach the final stage of redemption. Anyway, I hope I was clear. These are very, very deep concepts. I try to bring them down in some way for a simple understanding. But anyway, miss you all. Shabbat shalom. We'll touch base again very soon. Bye-bye.